So some of you I know, some of you I don't know. I'll just do a quick thumbnail. I started out in MCC in what we called then the Northeast District of the Metropolitan Community Churches in 1977 in MCC, New York. In those days, we had nicknames for the MCC churches, and the MCC out in New York City was called, they were named after soap operas. Imagine drama in MCC. And MCC New York was called The Young and the Restless. And we were a group of mostly very young people. And most of us were students at either Union Seminary or Columbia University, where I was a student. Not everyone, but the leadership all were. Not a single one of the leaders, including the pastor, was over 25. And we were very proud to be radical. We dressed up for church. That meant clean t-shirt. And all the churches in the Northeast District were very proud to be edgy. Edgy meant different things, but it was definitely the edge of MCC in many different ways. And we had 6 churches in the metropolitan New York area at that time, in Brooklyn, in Queens, Spanish language churches, English language churches, church in Harlem, there was a church in New Haven, Hartford serves today, all around upstate New York, Albany, Rochester, Syracuse, and all around New England too, in Maine, in Massachusetts. So it was a vibrant time in MCC, very different from today and similar too, I would have to say. I was very much enjoying over breakfast hearing about open table dinner church and its creativity and organizing technique and not worrying about some of the numbers and also being very responsive to needs and not worrying about structure. That reminded me of our church in New York City at that time, where we were meeting, we were squatting, literally, this is true, and what became the Gay Community Center. We had a weird little loft on 9th Avenue and 14th Street that you took your life into your hands to get to the 3rd floor or 4th floor. There was a sex club in the basement, not ours, mind you. And it was just a very different time, pre-AIDS, I have to say. And just hearing the organization of Open Table Dinner Church, we had experimental programs. It wasn't the main church service, but we organized around sex. This is really true. We had Friday nights at the center, one of the programs for men. And I was just recalling it, that it was not like a regular church service, but we would get upwards of 120, 130 men. We had communion, we had food, and it was about connecting. At a time of great coming out of the sexual revolution, at a time of great repression, coming out of that repression, pre-AIDS, creating a safe space where people could form community, where we broke up into small groups and for an hour had structured conversation about sex. And it was MCC that did that. Now this may sound almost incomprehensible to us today, but at the time it was very radical. And we did it in the name of church. And it wasn't like church. We didn't do it in church. There was no cross on the wall, but we did have communion in an informal way. And we sang weirdly old gospel songs that people grew up with, but were freeing themselves from. This was at a time when, we were still, people of my generation were freeing ourselves from the notion that gay was sinful, religiously, and pathological, psychologically. And I'm so grateful that there are generations now who don't bring that level of need or need to be free from it on the same level that we did coming out in my generation. That's what MCC was about. That was the crucible out of which MCC came at that time. We were convinced we were going to hell, or to jail, or that we needed to be committed. And that was the reality of the 60s and 70s. I was born in the 1950s. I'm not saying that those things don't exist today, but the reaction formation to that culture was what gave MCC part of its vitality then. And that's not true today to the same extent. And I just want to set that stage for talking about what it means, what reconciliation might mean for an MCC church going into the 2020s. Because I think reconciliation of sexuality and spirituality, for example, might mean something very different. So, to finish off my thumbnail, which ended up being a finger, I have been an MCC minister since 1983, and I worked at MCC churches in New York City. I was the pastor of MCC San Francisco for 15 years during the 80s and 90s, what we have come to periodize as the AIDS years. And then I was a denominational official working as an executive, was an elder, I was in charge of the ordination process for many years. And I also pastored churches in Glendale, California, in Guerneville, California, in Berkeley, California, where I was on the staff of Pacific School of Religion, and we had an experimental church there that I'll reference perhaps later if we have time. That was an MCC church, a UCC church, a Disciples of Christ church, and a Fellowship of Affirming Ministries church, all four together. And it's an experiment. Not all experiments can be measured by longevity. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Some things are not meant to last forever. They're about process, not product. And that is ministry, right? And then I was the interim pastor at Cathedral of Hope, UCC, once Cathedral of Hope, MCC. And I learned some things about reconciliation there, too. And then the MCC in Denver. And now I'm the interim minister at the Congregational Church in Needham, Massachusetts. Who knew? And I still retain, I have ordination credentials in the metropolitan community churches. I'm proud to say I'm an elder still. I don't know if they've just forgotten to do the paperwork, but I still am an elder. And I'm proud of that because in my period, elders were confirmed by the General Conference. That meant that there was a sort of some thought that people saw in us who became elders at that time, something. The queers chose their leaders for some quality, not virtue, I think. Perhaps a capacity to see things, not always popular things, and our willingness to say them. So I'm still an elder, but I'm also a United Church of Christ minister and a Disciples minister, and I'm a Fellowship of Affirming Ministries minister. And for those who aren't familiar with that, it's the denomination or organization that Bishop Yvette Flunder has that nests in an interrelated way with the United Church of Christ of largely African American, largely same-gender loving, largely Pentecostal. But those words don't even describe it. Churches that we have a relationship to with in MCC. And Rochelle, you're doing a really cool program that I hope you'll describe for us before the weekend ends with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. If I had a dream about the word reconciliation that I could say in one sentence, this is what my dream looks like. That one day, without any fuss about paperwork or proprietariness or politics, we would have an interrelationship, a permeable, creative interrelationship between the United Church of Christ, the metropolitan community churches, the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. Because I believe we're all doing the same thing, and we would do it better together than we're doing it separately. That's my reconciliation dream. But I still have 25 minutes to talk, so I'm going to talk about that. I want to thank some people who made it possible for me to be here. You know, I work in the United Church of Christ, but I do want to say this. I carry proudly the MCC banner everywhere I go. Anywhere I go, nobody doesn't know I'm MCC. Yeah. Okay? I assure you of that. And because I'm proud of it. I'm proud of it because it's who I am. I'm even more proud of it because it's who we are. And one of the things I've come to understand is MCC, it is a movement. You can't capture a movement, all right? It's not a building, it's not an institution. I mean, it is that, yes, has a history, has a trajectory. I don't know whether it will be here in 5 or 10 years if we try to keep it and freeze frame it as it is. But we, many of us in this room, will be here, and that means MCC lives because it is not just an institution, it's who we are now. We carry it in ourselves. And that's what I try to think of as I move in the United Church of Christ. As I speak about MCC, as I've done just in this past year at Harvard Divinity School, at Pacific School of Religion, at Hartford Theological Seminary, everywhere I go, everyone wants to hear, they don't want to hear about what I'm doing now. They want to hear about MCC, and they're very curious about how did we survive the AIDS years. So, just like Aaron has a great testimony, and was that cool or what?
Yeah.
I mean, everybody's got a story to tell. I have this weird story that's very particular, though not unique to me, but I seem to have it in a way that people want to hear about. How did we survive AIDS? That's the story that people want to hear from me right now. So I'm going around telling it everywhere I can. And it's an MCC story, right? So that's the story I tell. And I'm proud to tell it in the name of MCC because it's one of the gifts that we bring to the world. Reconciling and reconciliation is partly about knowing that you bring something in every situation as a gift. It's not something passive that someone brings to you or does to you or that you do to them. Reconciliation is active and every party is a participant. And I want to say this about reconciliation. We have gifts to bring in every act of reconciliation. So I want to thank the people who made it possible for me to bring this to you today. Alex, who asked me, I don't even know why he did, but he did, so I'm grateful. And I'm grateful to my home church of MCC Boston. Ragtag Church, I'm at 131 Cambridge Street in downtown Boston. When I was a student at Harvard, a postgraduate fellow, 20 years ago, I went there. And then 35 years ago, when I was a new preacher, I preached there from MCC New York. It's still there. And it's like a little lighthouse in the middle of the city. Have you ever seen the building? And people find their way there on Sunday night. Sometimes only 8 or 10 people. But you know what? It's still there. Like a lot of our churches, smaller numerically, still important as a safe place. How many times have we heard that phrase this weekend? So thank you, MCC Boston. And thank you, Robert and Lakeview and Take Loris, MCC. Those of us who have been in MCC a long time, hearing the phrase, Take Loris, MCC. You know what I'm talking about? Old timers besides me? Because there used to be another MCC, Take Loris, a women's church in Eagle Rock, Los Angeles. And at the time, did people fuss? There can't be a women's church. And it didn't last that long. My God, for the fuss it created, people would have thought it was a 5,000-member megachurch like Crystal Cathedral. But how important it was, not only for the people, for the women who went to it, but for the reminder that sometimes you need separate space, sanctuary space, for your own healing in order to be a participant in the broader world. These experiments in reconciliation are not measured by their longevity, but by their creativity and by the healing they do for the participants. Reconciliation, sometimes the visible marks don't last, but what they do for the people who participate does last. And I want to encourage all of us not to stand in the way of experiments in reconciliation. Reconciliation, the word, means this. It's a reestablishment where there has been an estrangement, a reconnecting. It assumes there has been a prior connection, that somewhere, maybe even a long time ago, maybe so long ago that people can't even remember, there was some kind of basis for unity or relationship, a rapport, something. The word reminds us that there was some reason for persisting and wanting to be together again. Even if it was so long ago that we can't even remember why. Or if the chasm or the hurt is so deep, we can't even imagine why we would want to try again. The word reconciliation still calls us back to a desire for relationship, that little RE part. And the conciliation is about the connecting. Reconciliation. It can have a lot of different meanings. It can be between two people, or between a person and a group, or among or between groups. It has other meanings too. It has a financial meaning. This is fascinating to me because I struggle with this piece sometimes with my checkbook. I know, just using the word checkbook marks me as hopelessly older. But bringing into congruence, reconciliation can mean two different realities, right? So in the grossest terms that we probably can understand, the bank says we spent this much, and we were convinced we didn't, or we did. And once a month or so, or every 3 months, or every 6 months, you bring these two realities into congruence by looking at both and figuring out what it takes to bring these realities back into relationship, examining it, bringing two different realities or more into the same, back together. It has a spiritual meaning. And I want to lift up 3 scriptures about reconciliation, just lift them up briefly.